Welcome to another episode of Unconditioned Mind. Unconditioned Mind is a project of Awakened Global, and Awakened is a movement that focuses on contributing to gender and racial inequality. And today we're focusing on racial inequality. You know, it has been so exciting because we had a dialogue on race where black and white came together to talk about race. I was just so amazed at how many people took interest in the dialogue and how many actually came, which means that South Africans are ready to talk about this topic. Yes, I know that it is a difficult topic. It's layered with many layers, but there's no one else who's going to solve this problem except black and white coming together and dealing with those layers, peeling them off so that we can be rid of this sketch and move on with life. So on racial inequality, my biggest issue had always been that this struggle that is dependent on others changing. That was my biggest struggle, because then it put me in a helpless situation. Imagine if your freedom depends on others changing, which is why I never contributed to the struggle, the broader struggle per se. Because for me, it was always clear that there's more to it than just race. So you have to look at social inequality, for instance. Social inequality is something that had always been there, you know, in society. Because there has to be someone at the bottom for others to move forward to the top, right? And so there were always slaves. In the era of feudalism, for instance, there was the landowner and the peasant who was at the bottom, and so on. Women have always been at the bottom. And then even in nature, for instance, the whole issue of the food chain, there are those who are at the top of the food chain and those who are at the bottom of the food chain. It's a sort of a natural thing for others to desire to be at the top, right? And then even this issue of others being superior, others being inferior, it didn't start with racism. It was always there. Aristotle back then said that it is all right in nature that others are superior and others inferior, others dominate and others are dominated. And he included slaves, he included women and the barbarians, for instance, in terms of those who should be dominated. And so even that whole issue of inferiority, it was not started with racism. Then the issue is that those who see themselves as superior, right? I mean, there are many reasons, and the biggest reason is economics, as we really know, and as I've said. But they need someone to be inferior for them to continue to be superior. Because if no one is inferior, who are you superior to? And the sad thing is that then they see this superiority as being part of their identity. So you can imagine then, we are dealing with people who see this as their identity. And if you see something as your identity, you're going to fight to keep your identity, right? And these are these layers that I'm talking about that we don't realize that we're really dealing with. And we're dealing with egos here at the end of the day. And you know that the ego always functions from a place of fear and survival. You know, the ego wants to survive at all costs. So there's the whiteness ego and there's the blackness ego. And both of these egos are manifesting themselves differently. If you start with the whiteness ego, for instance, sure, it sees itself as superior, and it's all about access to resources, economics, being at the top. And then the flip side is this fear of survival, this fear of losing my identity, and so on. And if you take the South African situation, for instance, it's now this guilt over the past, but still being defensive about the past. It's like we just want to wish away this problem. But at the end of the day, white people do not want to lose their identity. They don't want to lose their position of privilege. That's the issue. The blackness ego, you fight, right? I mean, not that black people didn't fight. You fight, and when you lose the fight, then you see another manifestation of the ego that also wants to survive now in this situation. So you sort of enable and allow this domination because now you have to survive. You need a job, you need a seat at the table, and so on. And on the flip side, of course, you see yourself as a victim and blaming others. So you can then imagine that we can't simplify this trying to find a solution to racism because of all these layers that I'm talking about. If you go back to history, for instance, that before 1652, black people were living in this country and Africans were living, they had their own social dynamics, which were actually not different from those in Europe, fighting over territory and things like that. But they never saw themselves as inferior or black. The whole thing of blackness and whiteness came after 1652. And so that's why I call it an illusion of blackness, and we're spending so much energy on an illusion that doesn't exist. Racism came after the Atlantic slave trade, right? There was no racism before. I mean, it was all about nationalities, and then if you're taken as a slave after a war, you just were a slave. You were not categorized in terms of race as such. But that's when, as Professor Melissa Stein of the Wits Center for Diversity Studies says, that when people then started to conceive using race to divide human beings, and we've now been all socialized and conditioned out of this desire for conquest, for access to resources, and then using others to get ahead, to get to the top. So I look at the situation and I say, now, if you are a black person coming into corporate, we all know that there's this stereotype of black person that is defined. Because myths were invented about us, we're inferior, black people are incapable, they are lazy, and all the things that were said. Unfortunately, this stereotype is shaped around these beliefs. Because myths, although they don't exist, they become beliefs. So these beliefs, and so when you come in, you soon read very quickly that we are expected to fit into this stereotype. And when you don't, you are quickly labeled as arrogant, egoic, and harassed. You don't get opportunities because you are seen as a troublemaker. Now, then black people then opt again, that ego that has to respond to the situation for survival. You opt for self-abandonment, where you realize that, hey, I mustn't be too assertive because others are uncomfortable when I'm too assertive. So I must dim my light a little bit so that I can fit in, so that I can be accepted, and it's not seen as a troublemaker, because I need the job. At least I have a seat at the table, and at least I share a slice of the pie, you know. Ego will always respond to and shrink from someone you consider more powerful, you know, more talented, smarter than you. So there are all then these dynamics that are going on in corporates, all for survival, but at different levels. And I ask myself that if then Black people are not allowed to be themselves, to bring their true self, their authentic self, then they are bringing half of themselves. And everybody is then losing because we are not getting the full potential out of this person. Because indeed, how can Black people ever reach their full potential if they are not their authentic selves and if they are bringing half of themselves so that others are comfortable? This whole thing is very sad, actually, because then we are all just fighting over the slice of the pie. Black creativity is not allowed, and therefore we can't expand this pie. We can't bake more pies, expand the economy, so that all those who are outside waiting for this middle class can come in. And I ask myself, what is the real problem in allowing others to be themselves, for instance? Because why can't we allow the salt in the cake to be the salt and the flour to be the flour? Because it is that diversity of all these ingredients that create the best cake. So can you imagine, even this pie that we're talking about is not the best pie because we're not allowing all the elements. And the salt is fine to be the salt. It says to me then, the truth of the matter is that we're dealing with egos. You don't know who you are. If you need someone to dim their light for your comfort, it means you don't know who you are. So again, to quote Professor Melissa Stein, none of us are authentic. And therefore, whatever we see, as glamorous as it may be, there's much more that we can achieve if we can deal with this issue of race and come together and work together from our authentic selves, having new capacity to create anew. Now, we look at these diversity and inclusion programs, which say we must make others feel like they belong. How can that ever work? Because will you now feel worthy to be in this space when someone else says you are worthy? Really, I mean, you have to know who you are. You've got to know that you are worthy. You've got to know that you are worthy now, not when others make you feel like you belong. We need to create these safe spaces in corporate where we can start to have authentic discussions around race and put this behind us and allow people to be themselves and move forward. But again, as I said in the beginning, Black people cannot wait for others to change because they are also conditioned. They have also been socialized. So they need to start the journey of healing the wounds of the past. They need to start the journey of peeling the onion, removing these layers and layers that have been put upon them. Because at some level, you also somehow believe that you are inferior. You know, you also believe that you're not worthy to be in these spaces, and which is why you are willing to self-abandon, for instance. And it's going to be a journey, and it's going to need commitment from each and every individual, because you have to change the individual in the system for the whole system to change. And we need to support one another through this journey. And we do encourage both black and white to do the work of delayering the conditioning and the socialization, because we all want this freedom. I don't think it is nice for you to be policing people to stick to the stereotype so that you're comfortable. You want to get on with life. You want to get on with your job. And when you are confident in who you are, that you don't need this, can you imagine how much productivity we'll have in corporate and will bring into the economy? So I then say, no one can put you at the bottom unless you allow it and enable it in some way. And why would you allow it? Because you still believe that there is some benefit for you to do so, right? That job, that seat at the table. If you look at the social change of the 17th century, for instance, those peasants allowed the domination by the landowners because they thought, okay, at least we've got something, we can get a portion of the crop and so on. Until there is an awakening within that says, I actually deserve more. I'm actually worthy of the best. And actually, I'm allowing this. And so you start to go through that internal revolution. Before there's an external revolution, there's an internal revolution that comes from the waking up of those who are being dominated. And it's amazing that once that awakening starts, once that fire is lit, no one can stop it. Because you're not going to rest until you are free, right? There could be wars, there could be fought for many years, but people will not rest until they are free. That's why we don't have an official slavery. Now, I'm not saying slavery doesn't continue, but wars were fought for many years. Colonialization, it was the same thing. Wars were fought for many years. And I'm just saying, once those people woke up and they became agents of that social change, they suddenly realized that they were never inferior in the first place. They were never poor in the first place, because suddenly they generated ideas, they became scientists, inventors, ushering in the new, what was new at that time, Industrial Revolution. And so what I'm saying is that in this age of more enlightenment, of maturity, we don't need another revolution. We just need to wake up, all of us. Black people waking up, white people waking up and realizing that there is nothing that we're fighting about, because we all want freedom. We all want to live in peace. We all want to be our authentic selves. We all want to create from our authentic self. We all want this mix and match of this cake. You see that cake when it is standing there. You can't even identify the salt and the flour. You just see a cake, right? And so let's create these safe spaces in communities, in corporate, in families, where we start to talk about this thing of race. In South Africa, for instance, we are facing a very difficult situation where we see a state in decline. And it's only when the citizens wake up and realize that it's going to take us to save our country. Politicians are not going to do it. And so we need to work together. We need to put aside our differences, because we're stronger together than when we're divided. We are a deeply divided country, and divided people can never progress. And so there's more benefit for us dealing with this race issue, so that we can rebuild our country together. Thank you.